Greetings and welcome. We are in Junior English, and our project now is to turn to one of the more interesting of the American poets, Henry, how you like this middle name, Wadsworth Longfellow. Now, I'm with you in your hymnals on page 256, 257, and right away, I just want to point out a couple of things before we now engage in two of his poetic offerings. If you have been with me already for a week or two in Junior English, you know that one of the texts we like to begin our school year with is Psalm of Life. Tell me not in mournful numbers, life is but an empty dream, for the soul is dead that slumbers and things are not what they seem. Life is real, life is earnest, and the grave is not its goal. Dust thou art, to dust returnest, was not spoken of the soul. The famous Psalm of Life in this world's broad field of battle, in the bivouac of life, be not like dumb-driven cattle, be a hero in the strife, etc., etc., etc. We now turn to the poet who wrote those lines, Psalm of Life, and we're going to look at two of his offerings, a set of lines from his very long poem, Song of Hiawatha, and then the other one, The Tide Falls. Now, tide rises, tide falls. Before we get there, though, I just want to point out something on 256 under literary analysis, okay? We're going to talk now today about, put it in your notes at 2B, poetics. Poetics. P-O-E-T-I-C-S. Poetics. Now, it probably is an easy guess for you that the word poetics comes from the word poetry. But the word poetics simply means the analysis or the study of poetic structure. Write the word down, structure. Structure. Okay? In other words, think of it this way. It's one thing for me to recite to you the opening lines of Psalm of Life, a project that you and I did earlier. Tell me not in mournful numbers, life is but an empty dream, for the soul is dead that slumbers, and things are not what they seem. Life is real. Life is earnest. And the grave is not its goal. Dust thou art, to dust returnest, was not spoken of the soul. That is one way for me to recite those lines to you. There is another way for me to recite those lines to you. Watch this, or maybe more importantly, listen to this. If I slow those lines down, and I say those words with certain inflections, the poem starts to sound like this. Tell me not in mournful numbers, life is but an empty dream. For the soul is dead that slumbers, and things are not what they seem. Life is real, life is earnest, and the grave is not its goal. Dust thou art, to dust returnest, was not spoken of the soul. Na 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 na. And some of you will go, please stop. All right, what we're talking about there in that na-na-na-na is what in your hymnal on page 256 we will call, write it down, meter. Meter. The rhythm of the poem. And one of the things that makes Longfellow so important is he is a craftsman at this meter game. Na-na-na-na-na. By the way, do you think he wrote the entire Psalm of Life accidentally? Doing this? No. And for those of you who enjoy the musical genre of rap, you are altogether familiar with the idea that there is a certain kind of meter or rhythm that can attune to a song and all of a sudden can make that a very catchy kind of genre of music. Some of you will say that for you, rap and listening and enjoying rap is less about the words than it is about the beat itself, the meter. Longfellow is going to play a very important part in developing rap. Do you understand the literary antecedents? You listen to rap in the 20th and 21st century, but it's a poetic style, it's a musical style that will begin long before with poetic intentionality. Whoa, how do you like that for a term? Poetic intentionality. In other words, it's very intentional, the rhythms, the meter of the line. The other word that's provided there for you is foot. The na-na, 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 na-na of the na-na, 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 na-na. That na-na, that is a poetic foot. Okay, that two-beat na-na, na-na, okay? Now there's different kinds of ways to understand this, and in your senior year, we'll be studying Shakespeare's iambic pentameter when he writes mostly his sonnets and of course a few of his plays. And we'll be talking about different kinds of meter. Here, we're simply going to point out these two terms for you to introduce them to you. Number two, let's talk about Longfellow's biography. Whoa, look at this. 1807 to 1882, which means that he lived almost the entire 19th century. That's important because he's a poet who will have gone from an early America into a booming America. I'd have you write that down. He's a poet who lives from the very early of America all the way through that booming time of America. I mean, look at that. At 1882, he's just 8 years away from 1900, okay? Which we call the 20th century, right? And still we're into the 21st century just early enough that for a good number of you, you're still born at the very end of that 20th century, right? So in other words, it kind of gives you a sense that Longfellow lived at the very back end of the 19th century. He saw a lot of amazing stuff that was about to happen in America, beginning to happen at the end of his life. Longfellow is part of a group of writers that we call the Fireside Poets. We want to write this down. The Fireside Poets. See, we live in houses in wintertime that for most of us are heated with forced air. Machines that warm up our house. But for a long time, and still one or two of you maybe even today, you use wood fires. Well, in the 1850s, everybody uses wood to heat up their house. And in the evening, there's no TV, there's no internet, there is no YouTube. So how do you entertain yourself? Are you ready for this? Believe it or not, you read. No kidding. Yes, you read. So families literally sit around the fireside and read out loud to each other for entertainment. Several American poets gained the term fireside poets because their poetry was so popular to read within their family around the fire. One of the reasons for this is the same reason that Longfellow is often going to be maligned. Maligned means made fun of or not taken seriously. I'm with you, in fact, on page 257, and it says the poet's legacy at the very bottom. Read that with me real quickly on 257. Longfellow's poetry has been criticized. Are you ready for this? I'm on the last paragraph of 257. Longfellow's poetry has been criticized for being overly optimistic and sentimental. Optimistic, happy. Sentimental, kind of sappy. Okay? But, keep reading with me. It was his optimism and sentimentality that made Longfellow the most popular poet of his day. In fact, Longfellow is so popular that in his time, that his 75th birthday was celebrated as if it was a national holiday. I'd write that down. We are now reading one of America's most famous poets in his lifetime. After his lifetime, not so much. We kind of see him as important, but we don't see him as that significant as a poet. From a critical perspective, Americans, let's just say it this way, easy for your notes, Americans loved this poet. They loved him. Okay? Two reasons why. One, he is very optimistic. He writes poetry that makes you want to be happy. Many have argued that the optimism that seems to be a fundamental part of what it means to be an American is born in the poems of Longfellow, a man who's always ready to be happy. Listen to the last lines of Psalm of Life. Let us then be up and doing. I mean, this could be great lines for any junior in high school to hear. Let us then be up and doing, with a heart for any fate, still achieving, still pursuing, learn to labor and to wait. In other words, go to work, but have patience because things don't always happen the way and in the speed you would want them to. That level of optimism is important for Longfellow. The second thing that made him so popular was that he engaged in storytelling when he wrote some of his poems. A classic example of this is his famous poem, Song of Hiawatha. I'm with you now on 258. Song of Hiawatha. I'm reading in the background information now on 258. The Song of Hiawatha is a long narrative poem based on a legend of the Ojibwe, a Native American people of the Great Lakes region. Hiawatha was actually Iroquois chief who joined together in efforts to unite the Iroquois people. Hiawatha takes on here a god-like heroic quality, and this poem, published in 1855 as Longfellow's most famous poem, contains 20 sections recounting Hiawatha's adventures. Okay, now what we're going to look at is just the opening lines of the prologue, an introduction to the poem. Now, the one thing I want to point out before we read this is that Longfellow helps to establish a certain kind of stereotype. I'd write that down. A certain kind of stereotype. Now, stereotypes can be very dangerous. But for Longfellow, he puts in the American psyche or mind that anytime we're talking about the Native American, we're talking about Hiawatha. The garb, the dress of the Native American. The images that we often think of in terms of quote-unquote cowboys and Indians, that notion of Indians, is going to be for Longfellow very much like the Rousseau stereotype of the native savage, as Rousseau would call it. In other words, Longfellow is going to give us a certain view of Native Americans that is going to be romanticized. This, by the way, is one of the reasons that it makes him unpopular in the 20th century, when Native peoples are trying to break these stereotypes. The easiest way I know how to express this to you is that, are you familiar at all with Native American peoples who are upset that school mascots, that professional team mascots often will reference Native Americans? So, for example, I don't know if you know this, that the football team that plays out of Washington, D.C. is called the Washington Redskins, and there's a large number of people who say that is no longer an acceptable name for a football team. Certainly not in the capital city of your nation. I mean, think about that. If your nation is wanting to celebrate equality and their football team is called the Redskins, which is, of course, not a positive but a somewhat negative appellation to the native peoples, then we ought to change the name. And a lot of people will say, oh, whoa. Don't bring that politics into sport. It's just the name of a football team, for crying out loud, with a drawing on a helmet. Let's not get all wound up. There are high schools who have, like our school does, a Native American ensign, like for us it's a warrior head, that they've actually changed their mascot. Because what they're trying to say to Native peoples is, we don't buy into this stereotype anymore. Where did a lot of that stereotyping start? Song of Hiawatha. So we're going to forgive, or try to forgive, Longfellow for some of this, because we're going to appreciate some of the power of his poetic diction. So let's take a look now at 258, the prologue to Song of Hiawatha, and in this we're going to be simply write it down. We're going to be at level 1. This is all we're really doing in this poem, so I'm helping you at level 1. We're going to be setting up the stage to tell the story of Hiawatha. So here we go, Song of Hiawatha, an introduction, the prologue, all right?
From Song of Hiawatha by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Prologue. Should you ask me, whence these stories? Whence these legends and traditions, with the odors of the forest, with the dew and damp of meadows, with the curling smoke of wigwams, with the rushing of great rivers, with their frequent repetitions and their wild reverberations, as of thunder in the mountains? I should answer, I should tell you, from the forests and the prairies, from the great lakes of the Northland, from the land of the Ojibways, from the land of the Dakotas, from the mountains, moors, and fenlands, where the heron, the shushuga, feeds among the reeds and rushes. I repeat them as I heard them, from the lips of Nawadaha, the musician, the sweet singer. Ye who love the haunts of nature, love the sunshine of the meadow, love the shadow of the forest, love the wind among the branches, and the rain shower and the snowstorm, and the rushing of great rivers through their palisades of pine trees, and the thunder in the mountains, whose innumerable echoes flap like eagles in their eyries. Listen to these wild traditions, to this song of Hiawatha. Ye who love a nation's legends, love the ballads of a people, that like voices from afar off, call to us to pause and listen. Speak in tones so plain and childlike, scarcely can the ear distinguish whether they are sung or spoken. Listen to this Indian legend, to the song of Hiawatha.
So right away at level 1, pretty simple. Let's go ahead and just jot down one or two things. This is going to be an introduction to a set of lines that will tell a story. By the way, did you notice it's going to be on page 259? I'm teaching you now how to read closer. Notice the poem says it's going to be lines that are two things, plain and childlike. Did you see this? Plain and childlike. I'm with you on line 37, 38. Speak in tones so plain and childlike. In other words, this isn't going to be a complicated story. Notice how Longfellow structures the introduction to his Song of Hiawatha. His first stanza asks a question. Where do you imagine I got the story? From whence these stories? Whence means where. Where did these stories come from? Where did you hear about these stories? And his answer is, notice in the second stanza, I got the story from the forest. I got the story from the prairies. I got the story from the native peoples. You can see the spelling of Dakotas. Did you see that? You live very close to North and South Dakota. Some of you maybe don't realize the Dakotas were a very famous tribe of people. The number we estimate into the potentially tens to hundreds of thousands of them at one point. Okay? Today, of course, not very many, tragically. But for a long time, the Dakotas people were a Plains Native American tribe that started way back in the east. Okay? And so he says, these stories, let's put it in our notes at level 1, these stories are very old stories. They come right out of the ground. They come right out of the prairie, right out of the forests. Notice the third stanza. We or ye, you, it means, who love the haunts of nature. But I want to point out something about the word nature. Uh-oh, did you see this? And we're already working now at level 2A and even a little at 2B. Did you notice at the top of 259 that the word nature is capitalized? Did you see this? The word nature is capitalized. Nature with a capital N. In other words, nature as in all of life. The sacredness of life. And one of the important things we want to point out about messages here is that Longfellow will celebrate the native understanding of the sacredness of life. Of course, some of the important terms that will become part of American culture, like wigwam, will end up being introduced. Most Americans who lived in cities had no idea about native peoples. They really didn't. And so Longfellow is going to, in many ways, draw a picture of what these native peoples kind of look like. Notice at the very end, he invites you not to read. Did you see this? For one or two of you that I looked up while we were playing this and you weren't reading it, but you were what? What's the last two lines of this poem say? See, this is why they called him the Fireside Poet. Listen to this Indian legend, to this Song of Hiawatha, exclamation point. In other words, this is going to be a lot of fun. I hope you enjoy reading it. Now, for those of you that are interested in how this story goes, you can Google on your own and you can easily find all of this poem. This poem goes on for a long, long time. Let's take a look now at another offering of Longfellow's very briefly here. 260, on page 260. The tide rises, the tide falls. Right away, as you start now a new annotation, you will see that in this poem, we are going to be focusing on the ocean. the sea, okay? And the cycle of tides as it relates, of course, to the sea. In the poem, we're going to recognize a couple of interesting things about the relationship between the tides and movement of people. So let's take a look at it, shall we? Let's just read it together. The tide rises. Are you reading it with me? 260, page 260. The tide rises. The tide falls. The twilight darkens. The curlew calls. Along the sea sands, damp and brown, the traveler hastens toward the town, and the tide rises. The tide falls. Darkness settles on roofs and walls, but the sea in the darkness calls. The little waves with their soft white hands efface the footprints in the sands. The tide rises, the tide falls. The morning breaks. The steeds in their stalls stamp and neigh as the hostler calls. The day returns, but never more returns the traveler to the shore, and the tide rises, the tide falls. Now, what are we going to say about a simple little poem like this? Let's work at level 1 real quickly. It's pretty easy to exegete a poem like this. First of all, at level 1, quite literally, this is a poem that says somebody came into town and somebody left. I mean, literally, it is that simple. Somebody came into town, somebody left. But notice that Longfellow is going to play an interesting game at level 2A. He's going to say that people come into our life and leave our life the same way that the ocean brings a wave onto the beach and then takes it away. Or the same way that footprints can be put on sand and you can see those footprints, but then they're gone when the ocean goes back the other way.